Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. In this episode I'll be making a lidded bowl from a section of ash log cast into iridescent coloured epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, I marked the centre of the blank and drilled a hole to fit over the locating pin on my circle cutting jig. With this jig I can cut the correct size to fit into the casting bucket. With the thinner blade in the bandsaw I could do the cut in one, but I've got into the habit of just cutting sections off in straight lines, then rotating the blank at the end to knock the corners off. All done, I moved on to the epoxy resin casting. I waxed the inside of the bucket so the blank will release after the cure and place the ash blank inside. The chosen colour for this project is purple, red and green pearl pigment, which I'm hoping will be a nice contrast to the light coloured ash. Moving on, I prepared 3 batches of epoxy resin. I'm only going to show one being mixed. It's my usual resin of choice at a 2:1 ratio, 150 grams of part B to 300 grams of part A, thoroughly mixed for 4 minutes, adding the colourant halfway through. All 3 batches mixed, I poured them into the casting bucket, added a waste block and plenty of weight to stop the blank floating in the resin. Then I placed it in the pressure pot, screwed the lid down and added 50 to 55 psi. This was left to cure for at least 24 hours. I didn't get back to this one for about 3 days, but after a first look, all seemed well. There was a small void in the resin, but that would be easily turned out. So after removing the excess material from the waste block, I marked the centre at both ends. Then I drilled a small hole for the tailstock centre and a deeper 8mm hole for the woodworm screw. With the blank safely fixed to the woodworm screw and using the tailstock to keep the whole thing securely clamped and centred, I turned the speed up to around 1000 RPM. No need to start slow as the workpiece was well balanced. Then I could begin turning. The Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher was first up, removing material to get the blank to round. Slowly at first I worked my way down through the excess resin to expose the ash. At first the resin was chipping quite badly, but I wasn't too worried as I still had a fair bit to cut away. As I got further into the blank, the chipping all but disappeared, and the carbide cutter made easy work of peeling away streams of resin, covering myself and the lathe in a blanket of cured epoxy. Thankfully I'm wearing a Trend AirShield Pro respirator to protect me from the dust and the flying chippings. Once I was happy that I'd removed enough material to expose the timber, I used the 3/8 bowl gouge to cut away the waste from the cutout, just above what would become the pedestal. And apart from an initial catch, this went smoothly, working down each side of the recess. In the area above the cutout where there was more resin, I switched back to the carbide cutters to blend the recess into the side, going back to the gouge to quickly remove material to get to the shape I was looking for. I was trying to keep as much height as possible in the upper bowl section to keep the pedestal and cutout in proportion. So I was using the full-size carbide cutter to gently blend and fare everything together. Whilst doing this, I decided the cutout needed to be deeper, so I set to with a mid-sized carbide to reprofile the recess. After using the large negative rate scraper to fine-tune the surface, I stopped the lathe to check my progress, and this is when I saw a deep gouge in the upper section of the cutout, and there was nothing for it. The only thing I could do was cut through it until it had disappeared. I used the bowl gouge to gently cut away material until the damage had been removed. Then I switched to the carbide cutter to reprofile the cutout into the side of the bowl. This process removed quite a lot of depth to the bowl section, so I took the opportunity to make the cutout deeper to try and bring things back into proportion. When I was happy with the outside, I gave it a quick sand with 80 grit to check that there were no tool marks I would have to deal with later on, and then I moved on to forming the mortise in the base. After flattening the base with a gouge and skew chisel, I marked out the mortise and defined the outer edge with a thin parting tool. Then I removed the bulk of the inner material with a gouge, cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter, before removing the tailstock so I could cut away the last piece in the centre. Then I sanded all of the outer surfaces from 80 to 3000 grit. And after sanding, I applied a finish to just the base. There was no resin to polish, so I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, applied a single coat of sanding sealer, denibbed with a non-abrasive pad. Next up was Yorkshire grit, thoroughly cleaned away, followed by a wood wax 22, all polished off with clean paper towel. With the finish applied to the base, I turned the bowl around so I could hollow out the inside. I used a 3/8 bowl gouge and the carbide cutter to remove the uneven upper part to get to a level surface. Then I set to with a bowl gouge, removing material starting at the outer section, cutting inwards. The reason for this is to take the weight away from the outer edge, which I find keeps the workpiece better balanced. When I had got near to the bottom of the bowl, I also removed material from the centre support before switching over to the carbide cutter. Using the carbide cutter, I was able to remove material down the side of the bowl section into the base, taking the wall thickness down to around 10mm or 3/8 of an inch. Once I had the inside roughly to shape, I cut the lid recess in the rim, defining the edge with a thin parting tool, then squaring it off with a 1/4 inch parting tool. With the rim done, it was time to remove the centre support. For this, I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to thin it down to a point in the base, and after a few passes it snapped off, leaving a small piece in the centre which was easily dealt with. I tried smoothing the inside with a large negative rate scraper, but the radius was too sharp, so I went back to the full-size carbide cutter to blend and fare the side into the base. Inside done, I sanded with 80 grit to check for tool marks, after which it was time to form the lid. For this, I cut a piece of ash down to size, also roughly removing the corners on the bandsaw, before fixing it in the coal jaws, using the tailstock to clamp it in place. The underside of the lid was first to be done. I faced off the blank and using the skew chisel, I cut the outer edge, leaving the diameter larger than the bowl. After checking just to make sure, I marked out for the lid recess. The 1/4-inch parting tool came in for forming the recess. I kept a bit off the line, and when most of the wood was removed, I switched over to the skew chisel to fine-tune the fitment to the bowl. It took a few goes, but I got there in the end without taking too much off. I added a pencil mark as a guide so I didn't get too close to the edge, then I formed a dish in the underside. Not strictly necessary, but it will make the lid lighter when it's finished. To finish the underside of the lid, I sanded from 80 to 400 grit, after which I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, quickly followed by a single application of sanding sealer, which I de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Yorkshire grit was up next, just a single application, thoroughly cleaned away with paper towel, followed by a single coat of wood wax 22, also polished off with clean paper towel. Underside finished, I removed it from the coal jaws and I remounted the bowl on the lathe, which was still fixed in the 4-jaw chuck. Then I placed the lid on the bowl and held it in place with a tailstock. Now I could shape the top of the lid. Using the bowl gouge, I reduced the lid diameter down to meet the edge of the bowl. A combination of push cuts and shear scraping got rid of the excess. In the end, I decided not to go all the way, and instead I left it proud of the rim, so I could fine-tune the two pieces together when the lid was closer to its finished shape. To shape the lid, I used the bowl gouge to shear scrape and the skew chisel to remove the waste material. I wasn't 100% sure how I wanted it to look, so I kept going until a slightly domed shape appeared. Now the lid was close to its finished shape, I used a skew chisel to blend and fair the two pieces together, being careful not to dig into the resin, and after a few more passes to fine-tune the curved top, the outside was ready for sanding, from 80 to 3000 grit, though I didn't sand the lid much past 400 grit. I added a small detail reveal between the lid and the bowl, and then using blue painter's tape, I fixed the two pieces together so I could drill a hole in the lid for the knob to be glued into. Hole drilled and the outside sanded, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, followed by sanding sealer, which was again de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Then Yorkshire grit, a single application, cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Next I had to remove the lid so I could get to the inside of the bowl. This had to have a final sanding, a clean down, then sanding sealer, then Yorkshire grit, so that the inside and outside were at the same finishing stage. Now I could continue with the acrylic polishing. First up, Polarshine 10, a single coat, inside and out, polished away ready for Polarshine 5, which was polished off with clean paper towel to leave a super shiny finish. And last but not least, Wood Wax 22, a single coat, applied inside and out, polished away with more paper towel, and not forgetting the lid, which also needed a single coat, all polished off to leave a deep lustre. And now the final piece, the knob to fit onto the lid. For this I used African blackwood, and as with my other lidded bowls, I made a miniature version of the bowl it would sit on, or as close as I could make it. After turning the piece around, I used a spindle detailing gouge to form the cutout, and the skew chisel to form the upper part of the bowl, adding a cut line under the lid, as in the full-size version. Next, I fashioned the base and the locating pin with a 1/4 inch parting tool. I set the calipers to 8mm to match the hole in the lid, and once down to size, I parted the piece off and fixed it directly into the chuck so I could finish the top. A quick going over with a skew chisel and it was done. I turned it around to fine tune the fitment into the lid, then I used medium thick super glue with an accelerator to fix it in place. I sanded it to a fine finish, then cleaned it down with denatured alcohol, applied sanding sealer, denibbed with a scotch pad, and to finish, I added a single coat of Wood Wax 22. And that's it, another project done. This one was a bit more involved, and I hope you followed along through all the stages. The colours in the resin make this bowl really stand out against the ash, and I'm very happy with it. And I hope you liked it as well. I would like to thank you all for watching, and please subscribe if you haven't already. A thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.